Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lunch with the pastor. I hope everyone is doing well, and this is going to be our last Bible study for the book of James today. We'll start a new study next week, so we're not ending the series of Lunch with the Pastor. We're just going to move on to a new topic next week. Speaking of new topics, I'm looking to see if there's a specific thing, or topic, question, or book of the Bible that you would like to study next. So if you think about it, if you're in our meeting today, or if you're watching this video after Thursday at noon, put a comment down in the section on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page, and let me know what book of the Bible you'd like to study, or question that has come up, or whatever's going on in your life, something that you would like to have answered that we could work together, work through, and see what we can come up with. I always like to do Bible studies that that means something to those that are a part of it, and not just the fact of, oh, let's do a Bible study, but meet you where you are. So if you have a certain book of the Bible, or certain something that you would like to study over the next couple of weeks, let me know what that would be, and we'll see what we can do as far as putting that together starting next week. But today we're going to finish looking at the book of James, talking about making sure that we are Christians 24/7. A lot of the Bible studies and things that we're a part of, we talk about the big things, but this whole study has all been about taking it day by day by day, the small things that we are supposed to do, so that we make sure that we really are making ourselves stronger and better every day. To quote our beloved John Wesley, to make sure that we truly are moving onward to perfection, and not just stationary, not just stagnant, but that we are preparing ourselves for those big moments that absolutely will come in our lifetimes. I like to think about this study from one of the parables that Jesus taught, the parable of the talents. In that particular parable, if you remember correctly, the master gives money to three of his servants. He gives 10 talents to one, 5 talents to another, and 1 talent to a third. And then he leaves. And when he comes back, he finds that the guy that had 10 talents is increased his money. I don't remember. I'm not looking at the parable at the moment, but he increases his money. I think it's twofold, but it might be 3. And the master is very, very pleased. He takes the money and he says, very well, and one of my favorite scriptures of, well done, good and faithful servant, right? The second one comes up that he was the one that had 5, and he has doubled the money or increased the money in some way. And the master again says, well done, good and faithful servant. You did exactly what I wanted you to do. The third one, because he was so afraid of the master, he had went and buried the 1 talent in the ground. And when he came and produced it to him, the master was really upset. And the bottom line is that the reason that I think about that particular parable when we've been talking about this for the past couple of weeks with James, is the fact that each of those guys, or at least the first 2 who were responsible, they had been watching their master. These are servants, so servants aren't necessarily going to be the most intelligent, right? They're not going to be highly educated. They're not going to know the ways of economics, because that's not what they've been. Their lives have been servants, right? And yet, because they obviously were paying attention to their master close enough to know how to go and barter, and how to know to go and get money and make money in that sense, they learned and were able, and even though it was probably stupid stuff day by day, just kind of listening to the master, watching the master, doing all that kind of stuff, they were able to actually go out into the world and do what the master did and make a profit. The third one had buried his head in the sand and never actually done anything. And so when the test came, he failed because he didn't have anything, because he didn't know how to do what he needed to do. And when we talk about evangelism, when we talk about anything else with the church, it's the same idea. If we are really listening and watching Christ on a day-to-day basis, not just when he does the miracles and not just when he does something spectacular and amazing, but just the everyday stuff that's in the scriptures, then when those big things come, we might actually be prepared for them and might actually be able to pass them, instead of not doing so high. But as I said, today we're going to finish the James study. Um, and I hope that over the past number of weeks, you've at least seen, and maybe even started to make a few changes on how you operate on a daily basis as a Christian, 24 hours, that kind of thing. Um, Now, as I said before, we all understand that being Christian is a lifestyle choice, right? We say that all the time. I've said it a lot of times, especially when we have people that join the church or or profess their faith, and I say it almost every Sunday at the end during the invitation of, that first step into faith is a step in a journey, not a step to a destination. It's we are taking a journey, and it will not end until after death. That's kind of the deal. It's not a short-term journey. It's a very long journey. Um, but I think at least all of us kind of understand that that's how Christianity works. That's what it is. And it's not just something that we do on Sunday mornings for an hour or so. And it's not something that we just do in a Bible study for about an hour or so during the week. It's it's every little decision, every moment of every day, making the choice to say, I am going to follow Christ. I am going to follow Christ. I'm going to let God's will be my will. That's what it means to be a devout disciple. Um, because when we accepted Christ into our hearts and our lives, we accepted the fact that our lives would never, ever be the same. And in order for us to become what I hope we hope, what I hope we want to be, or it should be, if you are a Christian, to be his hands and feet, to be the hands and feet of Christ, we have to accept the fact that it is going to require more than just a few tests along the way. It's going to require everything that we got and even more. So, what we've used James for up to this point is to understand that the daily life of a Christian should be one that continually informs, trains, and educates the believer in the preparations for the big moments, right? And just like in school, the easiest way to understand all this is through the idea of schooling, right? Because if you think back to the time you were in grade school, right? And you had daily assignments, you had weekly assignments, and then usually once or twice every grading period, whether it was 6 weeks or 8 weeks, or when you got to college, it was usually like twice a semester, that kind of thing. You had a major test that put to test all that you had learned up to that point, right? And so that's kind of the analogy that I like using with this whole thing is that, you know, a lot of times we focus on the big tests, but the fact is that if you do all the daily assignments and do the daily homeworks, the test, while it will be difficult because it'll be different, it won't be as difficult and will be manageable. But if you don't do all the daily stuff, then you'll never be able to do the major test, right? So over the period of time we've been studying James, we've talked about the difference between temptation and testing. I think that was really important because we understand what the difference between temptation is, being negative, and testing, which is actually a positive thing that makes us better disciples, better followers, and better Christians. Um, we spoke um, we spoke about how to train ourselves to see the positive in all situations, so that when the truly horrible things happen, when the trials go badly, when we find ourselves in not very good situations, we still might stand a chance of seeing hope when the rest of the world would say that there is no hope to be found. When we talked about temptation and testing, we wanted to take joy in the testing because it's a good thing, and then reach out for strength during the temptations, right? We talked about how our faith must have works, and while the works may seem small and insignificant from day to day, nevertheless, it prepares us for the massive works that God will give us opportunities to perform if, there's a big if we prove that we are worthy in the small things. Again, go back to that parable of the talents. What happened to the guy that had only one talent? The master takes his talent and gives it to the guy that started with 10. And he says, those who are responsible with small things will have more things, more responsibility added onto them, right? Same idea. And then that point bled over into another work that is most essential for all Christians, the love of the poor, which requires not just prayers for and pity for those who are poor, but an overt action towards them, an opportunity for Christians to actually put their love into practice, right? And finally, last week, or I guess Monday, since we didn't meet last week, we met on Monday again. We talked about how we should make sure to control and have dominion over our tongues every day so that we can truly be mouthpieces for God. And that's how we make sure that what we say, and I'm going to quote here from a current artist in the contemporary music scene of Toby Mac. We need to speak words of life to those that are around us, and we can't do that if we don't have control over the muscle that speaks. So we have to have control over our tongues. So I know as you listen to all that, it seems like that is a massively daunting task. You think of each thing that we've talked about. We've talked about 5 different topics, and each one is bigger than the last one. That's a lot to think about every single day, isn't it? And I can guarantee you that there's probably not going to be a night that you go to bed and go, I did that, I did that, I did that, I did that. Look at that, it was a perfect day. We're just not going to do that. We're flawed human beings. It's who we are. It's what we are. It's not something that we're going to necessarily be able to do. Some days, think about it, and I can say this about myself. Some days I'm just good to brush my teeth because the rest of the day is so busy that I may not even be able to eat lunch. I get so busy, so wrapped up in things. Some days are just bad days. One of those days that everything you touch just turns to garbage. That you can't do anything. There are days that you're sick and you don't feel good and you don't get anything done. There's so many different kinds of days that we have. But even on just a normal, regular, everyday day where I get stuff done, I have time to myself, I have time to play with the boys, I've gotten a good night's sleep. The bottom line is this is still a huge list of things to remember to do throughout the day. So we can have 1 or 2 mindsets when we think about all this, honestly. The first thing is we can just throw up our hands. We can throw up the hands in the air and say, it's not fair. There's too much to do. There's too much to think about. It's not fair. And you can look up to God and you can yell at him all you want. You can say, it's not fair that you place so much work on us when there is so much more to be done in the day. It's just not fair. Or we can have the better attitude. We can we can do what Christ did, what Paul did, what James tells us to do, and what almost everything else in the scriptures tells us to do. We can pray. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at James and how he describes and talks about daily prayer. Now, if you want to do even the minimum of these past 5 weeks, if you want to do just the bare minimum of them, then you're going to need all the help you can get. Because honestly, here's the brutal truth. It doesn't matter what kind of day you're having. If it's the best day in the world, the best day in human history, or the worst day, here's the truth. You cannot do this training on your own. This daily routine, this daily list of things that we have to do to make sure that we're being the hands and feet of Christ, that kind of training cannot be done by ourselves. It's just not possible. we're not strong enough, we're not good enough, we have too many flaws. We just can't do it. Now, I think about it this way. When I was in grade school, high school, and junior high, I played football for 4 years. Seventh grade, eighth grade, ninth grade, and 10th grade. I played football. And one of the things that we learned while I was playing sports, namely football, through the years, was the weight room. It's not surprising. Um, Anyone who ever played a team sport through the school probably found themselves in the weight room at least once or twice during the week. And so you learn different things about the weight room. And I'll never forget that every time, no matter if it was in junior high or in high school, our coaches always had some of the same cardinal rules about weight rooms. And one of them was that you always, always, always had a spotter. You always had someone who was watching you as you lifted your weights. And it didn't matter if you were doing a small amount of weight or you were maxing out. You always had someone watching your weights to protect you, right? Now, here's why I talk about this. Trying to do this list of things without help would be like going into the weight room, trying to max out your weight on whatever machine you're wanting to use, adding 100 pounds to your max, and then going for it without anyone else being present in the gym. It's just not going to go well for you. So we will need help. And here's the thing, we're granted it as long as we just ask for it. It's there for the taking. We just have to reach out and ask. The psalmist in the 46th Psalm says this: God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. We have to go to God for help. That's the only place we can find this kind of help. It's the only place we can go. And prayer is the way that we do that. So we're going to look at James and what he has to say about daily prayer. And the first place we're going to look is in the 4th chapter, and we're going to look at verse 2. And this is what James 4:2 says. You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. Now, I have to admit, there's a lot in this one verse. It seems like truckloads. And it seems like James has kind of gone off the deep end, right? I mean, for goodness sakes, he's talking about you want something, you don't have it. And so the next logical step, obviously, is, you go kill the person to take it. That seems a little ridiculous, doesn't it? It seems like James is, acting very, very immature, thinking that the rest of the human race is very, very immature. And I think that all of us, or I would hope all of us, that's not the next logical step in our thought process of, I want X, my friend has X, so I'm just going to go kill him and take it. That's just not how we think, or at least I hope it's not. But just because I want something doesn't mean that I'm going to resort to murder to get to it. That's what our first knee-jerk reaction to James's statement is. But I would argue that what James is trying to say here, we've missed the point. We've misunderstood James in his statement here about murder. And if we understood what James was actually trying to say, I think we wouldn't be taken aback so much by the inflammatory speech that he actually uses. So, without further ado, I'd like to just break this down for you all a little bit. And I want to start with the inflammatory word. I want to start with murder. I want to start there because that's the piece that really kind of gets us. It really makes us think that, James is only talking about people who want to go to extremes or anything else. He's not talking to all of us. But the fact is that he is. He's talking to everyone. Now, as I said, I have to admit, and everyone has to admit, that it seems at first glance that James is this 5-year-old who thinks the world is going to end because their parent told them to get off the screen and go outside and play after spending the past 2 hours watching. Oh, sorry, that's me. I've been doing that with my son for the past number of while, and if you have kids at your house, I'm sure you've been doing the same thing. It's that over exaggeration, over dramatic response to it. James says you don't have something, so he just goes completely over the top and says, instead of trying all these other ways to get whatever you want and you're not, and someone else has, you just go and take it from them by murdering them. But while James is absolutely using some hyperbole here, and I'm not saying that he's necessarily saying it exactly this way, or that he's saying that we would commit murder, he is hyperbolizing this a little bit, but it's not to the extent that we tend to think it is. He's just trying to get people's attention. He isn't actually using it to the degree that you might think. And to show you this point, I'm actually going to go to another scripture, the Gospel according to Matthew. In chapter 5, verses 21 through 22, these are Jesus's words to the disciples and all who would listen to him as he's teaching. He says, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." That's the law. That's Torah. So Jesus is explaining Torah. And what he's trying to do, and every time he does this kind of thing where he says, you have been told such and such, he always caveats it with, but I say, da da da. He has another thing that he wants to say. It's not different in the sense that they don't contradict each other. What Jesus gives as his response is normally a positive understanding of the message of the law, but also it goes to the heart of the law. Why is that a law? When I was in college, it was always said, you could look at a law 2 different ways. You could look to the letter of the law or the spirit of the law. The letter of the law was always very black and white, very rigid, and didn't allow for any exceptions. It didn't allow for anything else. It was literally to the letter of the law. But the spirit of the law gave you the flexibility in the law, because the spirit of if you look to the spirit, you understood why the law was enacted to begin with. And the enforcement of that law was towards that end and not just a letter to letter understanding. And so normally what Jesus would do in these situations is he was taking what the Pharisees and Sadducees had been teaching, and that was the letter of the law, and teaching the people what the spirit of the law was. Of course, the spirit of the law is God himself. So what he's teaching them is who God is, which is exactly what he always did. So in this passage, we have Jesus saying, you've heard it said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. And we get this next part. It says, but I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. That's really interesting, isn't it? If you are angry with a brother or sister, you are liable to the same judgment that a murderer is. And if you, and Jesus goes further, he says, and if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. That's exactly what Jesus says. And, we've seen this before. We've seen this kind of understanding before, right? Because there's another passage where Jesus talks about adultery. And he says, if you lust after someone in your mind and in your heart, then you have already committed adultery. And again, a number of people will read that scripture and say, but Jesus, I never touched the other person. It was just a fantasy. It was just a thought. It was just a fleeting thought that just randomly stuck in, went into my head. And what Jesus wants us to understand is, yes, at some level, this is hyperbole. but at some level it's not. As much as it's hyperbole in the sense that, you know, by being angry, you haven't committed murder in the sense that they're still literally walking around. But Jesus wants us to understand that when you consider the fact that by the mere fondling of an idea in your head, it is the first step down the slippery slope towards the sin. Because, again, and I've talked about this with adultery in previous sermons and series and whatnot, and Jesus uses this a lot, this kind of thought process a lot, that the mere thinking about it, well, the first time you think about it, you get rid of it real quick, but then it comes back, and then it grabs a toehold somewhere, and then you start to fantasize a little bit more about it, then you start to think a little bit more about it, then you start to actually put plans in motion, then when the opportunity arises, you actually have the ability to act on that impulse, and all of a sudden you've committed a sin just because a little ways in your past you allowed a thought to germinate in your head. And we all do this, whether it's with adultery, whether it's with any other kind of sin. It all starts in the mind. It starts in a thought process of, wouldn't it be nice if this happened, or it would be easy to do this, or whatever the case may be. So when James gets into his statement and he says, if you want something and you don't have it, you commit murder, it sounds like ridiculous hyperbole, but then we hear the words of Christ. Those words of Christ from the Gospel of Matthew. If murder constitutes judgment, that's the word that Jesus uses, then Christ says that anger brings forth the exact same thing. Jesus is using the same logic as when he spoke about lustful thoughts being adultery. It's the same idea. Now, if you want to think to yourself that thoughts will never turn into action because you're just not that sort of person, think again. This is just easy. This is for all of us. I don't care who we are. It's for all of us. Jesus isn't just looking at your time here on earth. And this is the other thing that we misinterpret. We think about the fact of Jesus is talking about this thought process being only something that happens from the time we're born to the time we die. But Jesus is looking for the entirety of eternity. He looks at you and me as eternal spirits, not as just human beings. We are eternal spirits, and he's looking and teaching us how to live an eternal life, not just a physical life here on earth, but an eternal life that encompasses all of eternity. And so here's what Jesus sees, and why he says the mere thought is what's so important to get rid of, to not have, or to rebuke as soon and as harshly as you possibly can, because he's looking at all of eternity. The permission of a thought, when we acknowledge and allow that thought to take hold in our head, even for a brief moment, and it doesn't matter how small it is, it will continue to get stronger over time. Now, here's where we get messed up, because we sit there and go, well, that thought, a thought of murder, we're going to take murder, since that's what we're talking about. It would take a heck of a lot for us to get to that point where we would actually act on it, right? I would hope so. But that thought might be there, okay? So let's say in 80 years, would that thought be strong enough to make us act on it? Probably not. Again, I'm going to go on a limb and say that we're all good people at heart. It would take an extraordinarily large amount of stuff to happen for us to get to that point. So 80 years, we sit there and go, okay, in my entire lifetime, I don't care if it started when I was really, really small and lasts the entire of my life, I am not going to commit murder. And it's like, great. In 80 years, you won't be able to do it. But what about in 1,000,000 years? What in about 1,000,000,000 years? Because that's eternity. Eternity, you're left all alone with your thoughts. Can you withstand that, the strength of that for that long? No, eventually it will break you. If the thought has all eternity to work at you, no one is strong enough to withstand it forever. And that's what Jesus is trying to get us to understand, that we are eternal beings trapped here on this earth for a short period of time. But what we do on this earth makes so much, it's important to what our eternal life is going to look like. Now, as I say all this, and as I wrote all this stuff down in my notes and everything else, it sounds like we are all so condemned by just the mere thoughts rattling around in our heads that we could be understood to already be pretty much destined for hell and be done with it. We could just throw up our hands and give up now, because it does just kind of sounds like that, doesn't it? Because honestly, who hasn't among us had an impure thought? Man, we've all had them, probably on a daily basis. And, it's just one of those things of sometimes we just can't control what goes on in our own minds. Something just pops up, or a dream, or there's lots of things that we can have some impure thoughts. And if we go with this understanding, then we can condemn ourselves real quickly. We all have in the past, and we all will have them in the future. That's what these impure thoughts are. Of course, now here's the thing. Of course, we should try very hard to control those thoughts, rebuke them as soon as they come into our heads, and get them and repent of them, ask forgiveness, and all that kind of stuff. But just like the tongue yesterday, we will never be perfect at controlling them. So then the question becomes, what are we supposed to do? Again, we have two options. We can throw up our hands in the air and say, no, I just can't do it, and give in, consign ourselves to being sinful creatures. Or we could do the Christian thing. We could follow James's advice. Because James gives us the piece of advice that we all already know. God will always be on our side. And all we need to do is call upon him. We need prayer. That's the bottom line. Now, hopefully, over 2 years of me being at this church, and you all knowing me fairly well, you hopefully know that prayer is something that is vastly important to me. It is one of the crux of my faith. It is one of the things that I believe is the greatest tool of all the tools that God has given to us. I believe that prayer is the greatest tool that God ever gave to us, because above all the other things that God has given to us, and he's given to us lots of things, don't get me wrong, there's lots of wonderful, wonderful, wonderful things that God has given to us to prove not only his love for us, but to strengthen and uphold his people. Of all of those things, I believe prayer to be the greatest. And the reason is because prayer, above all other things, puts you in direct communication with him. It is the place where you can receive literally anything that you could possibly ever need. I mean, think about it. You need wisdom. Go to prayer and God grants you wisdom. You need strength. Go to God and God will send the Holy Spirit so that you are filled with his strength. Whatever you need, God's there to provide exactly what you need. Not because you asked for it, but because he loves you so much and he has great plans for you to be part of his ultimate plan. He will take care of you. And we talk about this in prayer all the time. Now, here are James's words. James's words show us that prayer is not just for times of trial, but prayer is for all times. And of course, why should this surprise us? Jesus, after all, would go time after time after time after time again on his own to pray, right? Luke's gospel gives us what has been titled the prayerful Jesus. It's in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus goes off more times than any of the other Gospels and has his moments of prayer. But he secludes himself over and over again so that he can be with his Father, where he can pray. Think about this. Jesus thought prayer was so important that he gave us one. No parable, no hidden meanings, just a verbatim prayer that we could copy from him. We call it the Lord's Prayer, and we say it every Sunday morning, and I'm sure most of you say it during the week. Of all the things that Jesus taught, it's one of the very few times when Jesus is like, here it is. Take this. This is more important than me being, cryptic with my messages or me speaking in parables. I want everyone to know how to do this one thing. And here it is. And again, time after time, we see him wander off from the group and pray in seclusion. We see him after great miracles praying. We see him after great crowds and lessons praying. We see him after great trials praying. We see him at the end of his life praying. Praying is what he does constantly. And if Jesus, the Son of God, is doing that much prayer, it should make an impact on us that we should be doing even more, right? Now, the final words that I want to say on this passage from James is I want to highlight James's example. So in the 5th chapter of James, as I said at the very beginning, on 13, on verse 13 and so on, it gives us, the whole thing of if you're in a joyous place, you should worship. And if you're in a trial place, you should pray, and all this other kind of stuff. And then James goes into this example. He uses Elijah as his example. And I think it's very interesting as to why James uses Elijah. First off, it's interesting in the sense that he doesn't use Jesus. Of all the prayer times that I just described to you, and we kind of listed off really, really quickly, there had to have been a perfect instance where Jesus prays, and James would point to it and say, "Pray like Jesus, pray like Jesus." And he doesn't. He goes back to Elijah. But there's a couple of things that I want to highlight about this section that hopefully will give you a little better insight into what James is trying to talk about and give you some more details on what it is that we should be doing to follow Christ closer. Now, the first thing that I want to answer is the easy question of why Elijah? Why does James use Elijah above so many other people? Because there's lots of people in the scriptures, both in Old and Jesus in the New Testament, that could have been used. And yet, James chooses to use Elijah as his example. And there's a couple of reasons why. First off, Elijah was seen by the Jewish people as the greatest of the prophets. He was the epitome of all prophets. Samuel, Eli, all of the other prophets that you know by name, they were all second to Elijah. And Elijah was also one of the people of the Old Testament that the Jewish people looked to with probably the most reverence. He was in the same conversation, if not higher up, than Moses, who gave us the law, David, who was the greatest king, Abraham, who was the father of all of Israel. But Elijah was the greatest prophet. Elijah produced sign after sign, miracle after miracle throughout his tenure as prophet. So much so that when Jesus was walking the earth, he was equated to Elijah on numerous occasions and called the second coming of Elijah. Now, I believe that most important thing for James, why he picked Elijah, had actually nothing to do with all this. The most important reason that he wanted to use Elijah instead of Jesus or anyone else was because of what Elijah's prayer controls. In the example, James goes back to probably Elijah's one one of his top two moments. During this, right after the drought, he has the scene with the Baal or Baal, however you want to pronounce the god's name, with his acolytes. And that's when he, you remember that story. They're up on the hill, and he makes a burnt offering shrine and gets the acolytes to try to get Baal to ignite the burnt offering, and they pray, and he makes fun of them and tells them that their god may be on the toilet and all this other kind of stuff. And then he then takes his bull, cuts it up, puts it on the altar, has them douse the altar in many, many buckets of water until there's a moat that's around it. And then he speaks one word, and God ignites the whole thing to the point where even the stones are melted. And that as I said, that's obviously one of his top moments as well. But this is another one. Elijah goes and he says, there will be a drought. And the drought will be started by my word, and it's ended by my word. That's what Elijah says. And the reason that James highlights this and goes to this point for prayer is so important. But we in the modern day church and we in modern times skip over it because we don't have the ancient understanding. Now, what I want you to do is think back. I want you to think back to when the disciples and Jesus go across the Sea of Galilee and the storm comes upon them. Do you remember that story where Jesus is at the front of the boat and he's sleeping? And there's a storm that rises up on the Sea of Galilee. And remember how the disciples were just scared to death of the storm. And they go to him and they ask him that question. Do you not, what are you doing? Why are you sleeping? Do you not see that we're perishing? Do you not see that we're dying? They're scared to death of this storm. They're scared to death that they aren't going to make it across. They're going to die there in the sea. And Jesus calms the storm. Remember, Jesus rebukes the storm, calms the water. And you remember how amazed the disciples were. Now, while, of course, it had to be absolutely amazing to witness that kind of a miracle. And no doubt, the biggest reason that they were in such astonishment is that to this point in their journey with him, they only saw Jesus as one thing. They saw him as a rabbi, maybe even a prophet, but most likely they saw him as a great rabbi. They were his disciples. They were learning from him. But up until this point, no one had said that Jesus was God. And here's where this changes, because there were certain things in the ancient world that were deemed to be of a godly realm, essentially things that no mortal man could ever hope to even touch or do anything with. It had to be God. And the weather was one of those things. No mortal man could control the weather. Period. The end. That was the realm of the gods. So when Jesus gets up and calms the storm, he has now gone into the godly realm of power. They could accept the fact that a miracle of healing the blind man or healing a leper or those types of things, those could be done in their eyes, in their society. Those could be done by a prophet. Those could be done by someone whom God had bestowed some of his power onto. But weather was not something that was ever given as a power. That was something that was exclusively God's realm. And all of a sudden, Jesus stands up and he changes the weather. And the people and the disciples on the boat look to each other and they say, who is this guy? Wasn't he just a rabbi? Wasn't he just an impressive orator? This is not what I signed up for. This is not the same guy. who is this guy? Now, then we go to Elijah. When Elijah prays, he controls the weather, something that only God can do. Now, do you see how important Elijah then becomes as a prophet? If he's no other prophet has been able to control weather. Been able to control so many other things, kings and nations and all that kind of stuff. They've never been able to control weather. And all of a sudden, Elijah has the ability to pray and rain stop, pray again, and rain come. That's what Elijah is allowed to do. Now, it's always caveated with the fact that God is the one that's telling him to do these things. So Elijah doesn't have the power to say, okay, I just don't want rain now. God, stop the rain, and the rain stops. He has an edict from God to say these things. But at the end of the day, the statement is the same. Elijah tells the king, there will be a drought. I'm going to start it with my word, and it won't end until I say the word for it to stop. Right? Those are the words of Elijah to King Ahab that began the drought, and it was his words that ended it and brought forth the rain. If you want to go read that whole story, it's an amazing story. Go read 1 Kings chapter 17 and chapter 18. It's an amazing story if you've never read it, or if it's been a little while since you've read it, you should go back and reread it. It's just 2 chapters. It won't take you very long. But this not only explains why James uses Elijah, because Elijah is a man. He's not God. He's not anything special. He's just a man. But also why he chooses this example. He not only chooses the greatest of the prophets, he chooses one of his most important tasks where he prays that the rain stop. And also by recalling this story, any faithful Jewish person would remember that it was during the drought that Elijah, through prayer, brought the widow's son back to life on the mountain. So not only is James hearkening back to Elijah for the drought, he's hearkening back for the whole story and how much prayer it was involved in this. Elijah was constantly in prayer with God, so that everything that he did, from the calling of the drought to the ending of the drought to the raising of the widow's son, all of it is done through prayer. And he wants us to see the power of prayer. Now, the second question that kind of stems from this is, why then not the story of Jesus? And to be fair, I think the really big reason why James doesn't use Jesus is because Jesus was God. The simple answer is that James wants us to know that there is a precedent for a man, a human being, not a man/God, to do the things that are in the realm of God. Of course, Jesus could do the things in the realm of God. He was God. But what James wants us to understand is that human beings can do that stuff too, only in prayer, but we can do it. You see, if Jesus was the only one who did something, it could be easily said that Jesus did it because he was Jesus, right? And because he was the one that did it, then it's easy to make the comparison and make the argument that Jesus did it only because he's Jesus. We aren't going to be able to do it because we're not Jesus. Now, to be fair, and I would have to say this is a garbage argument, because Jesus himself said that we would do great things, even greater things than he did. So anyone who wants to argue the fact that, well, Jesus did something that we can't do, it's garbage. Jesus says that not only can we do everything that he does, but that eventually we would do even more than he did. And so at some level, this is that understanding shouldn't be there. But James also understands that he's talking to a bunch of people. And while devout Christians will not necessarily use that argument, there are plenty that would. And he wants to eliminate that by saying, okay, I'm not even going to allow that argument to have a place. Instead of going to Jesus, who I could make countless arguments with, and they would all be valid, I'm going to go to someone else. I'm going to go to a purely human person and prove that even a regular human with prayer can do the things that only are allowed to God, that they can enter into the realm of God through that prayer. And the reason that James highlights this, and the reason that I wanted us to read this passage after doing everything we've done with the 24-hour Christian, with the daily routine of being a Christian, is the fact that if that's the kind of power that is within prayer, and remember what Jesus says, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you could, and this is something we don't normally see this parable with, or this illustration with prayer, but the fact is that's exactly what Jesus is saying. You could ask, you could tell that mountain to jump, and it would jump into the sea. But who are you telling? Not necessarily the mountain. You're telling God. You're praying. If you have faith like a mustard seed, all you have to do is pray, and it's done. And that's what James wants us to understand, is that if you're going to live this life, if you're going to train every day to be better and better and better, it's not something you're going to be able to do yourself. You have to have help. But the help that you need is there in abundance if only you'd ask for it. Prayer becomes the most important piece that we need in order to make sure that we are getting better today than we were yesterday, getting better tomorrow than we are today, so that when those major tests come, we're ready to pass them with flying colors. And that's all I've got for our study today. I hope it's something that helps. I hope it's something that gives you courage and encouragement to be better, to really struggle to try and make sure that every day is a better day than the previous one, and that we can really train ourselves to be his hands and his feet. As I said at the beginning, if you think of a book that you'd like to study, or a topic that you would like to talk about, or even just a question that you would like to have answered, post that comment down in the comment section here on our on the YouTube channel, or on our Facebook page, or you could just text me or call me and talk to me about it that way. Whatever's easiest for you. And otherwise, I will see y'all here yet again next Thursday at same time at noon here on Zoom, and we will study God's Word together. I hope y'all have a wonderful week, and I hope to see you on Sunday morning at church. I'll talk to y'all later.